what? Here we go. All right, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to have you join us for December, our final book club of the month, our Mindful Dating Book Club. For those of you who don't know, my name is Radha Patel. I'm the founder of Single to Shadi, and we are a South Asian singles platform, kind of helping people navigate this online dating world through matchmaking, hosting events of our own, and doing community-based events such as the book club we're at tonight. I'm so excited to be joined by tonight's or this month's book club pick, Grishma Shah, and the book we chose is Anagram Destiny. So, Grishma, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you guys who don't know Grishma, she is the director of global business studies and a professor at Manhattan University. She is an author, which is the reason why we're here today. And she's also a volunteer at Operation Smile. So, Grishma, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself?
So much, Radha. Hi, Susan, Ramisa, and Sneha. Thanks for joining us. I know it's December and probably not the best time of year to join a book club or to join a Zoom at 8 o'clock at night. So I really appreciate it. But like Radha said, my background is as an academic in global development. And so Operation Small is the organization I volunteered with when I was in high school, and I've traveled around the world with them doing service work. And it really is the catalyst behind my career, which is in global development. And now I teach at a business school, but I teach a lot of their global business and global development courses. And I one day just felt like the academic part of me was sucking out all the creativity in terms of writing. And so I thought, let me do something that, so I started this journey about 7 years ago, and I wanted to do something that just, it was like, I wanted to get back to writing and do something creative. And so that's why I added author to, to the introduction that Radha just gave. And, look forward to having a good chat with you. And I'm totally open to any questions. So.
Awesome. Welcome, Grishma. So, absolutely, folks, if you've read the book, are in the process of reading it, or just interested in hearing from Grishma today, this is an open kind of concept. We're an intimate group, so feel free to jump in. If you're comfortable, you can come on camera. Otherwise, you can unmute and ask your questions. We also have the chat going. All right. So, with that, let's get started. Grishma, do you want to hold up the book again? I loved the actual physical copy of it. Beautiful. If anybody has the book, there's a huge clue in the illustration that I just ignored the entire time. But I just really loved it. I think that you did a good job with the themes running from the cover to the story to a little bit of the background we just talked about, but the narration in the Audible book. So we'll touch upon a little bit of all of that. But Grishma, the reason I reached out to you and the reason I kind of, I resonated with your story so much. So I want to ask, what inspired you to write Anagram Destiny? Like, why this story?
Okay, so first of all, Radha, thank you so much. I think you mentioned that you read about the book in an article that came out a few months ago about the book and had a bit of my background. You're like, oh, this is so interesting. So as I was saying, so the book it's a dual timeline love, like a sort of deep-seated love story with a lot of historical events. So I want to give. I don't want you to just think of it as a romance because it needs some trigger warnings if that's what you want. But I was sort of inspired to write it because one, my dad is a really good storyteller. Now, if you have like Indian uncles in your life who are like the life of the party and are always telling these amazing stories, and you're just like in awe because they're telling you about their gam or their village they came from, whatever. So my dad is one of these people who is just always storytelling, and he has this knack and talent for oral storytelling. I've always been in awe of it, and I didn't inherit it. Like, unfortunately, I am like, I don't have the great knack for keeping the whole room engaged with a great story, but I do like to write. And I thought, he has such great stories. I'd like to just capture a bit of his background, a bit of what he says in my own way. So that was one of the reasons I was inspired. I was like, what can I do to sort of honor this whole story of theirs, like their immigrant journey, what it was like with where they came from, home, and all of those things. And a part of it, as Radha would tell you, is it's about two children essentially who grow up at a roadside motel owned by their families. As you know, a lot of roadside motels in the United States are owned by Indian Americans, particularly Gujarati families. And it all sort of happened through a series of events in the 70s and 80s and all of those things. And I happened to be a byproduct of that. My family immigrated here when I was 7. Um, and the first place we lived was a roadside motel that my uncle owned. And I sort of used to follow my grandfather around and my uncle and my parents around and help them clean the rooms and kind of just do whatever was needed to survive or whatever they were doing to survive. And I thought, well, I'd love to capture that part of it because it's such a unique history of our community in this country. And I don't know if I know there have been other stories at maybe motels and stuff, but this is a very unique story. And it's funny because the more I talk about it, the more people will tell me I grew up at a roadside motel, or I have family that, like every Christmas we spent at the motel and everyone took a room or whatever it is. So part of me, I just wanted to, like, if we don't tell our own stories, especially if we've lived through them or our parents have lived through them, who's going to tell them? It was really important to me. So I said, let me start with what I know, right? They say, if you're going to start writing, like start with what you know, because everything else is going to take a ton of time. So that's what sort of inspired me to capture that background, to capture the stories my dad told and all those things.
And Grishma, that resonated with Sneha as well. She
Yeah,
wrote in the chat that she also grew up in a hotel or motel and likes to hear about other people's experiences. Me too. I also grew up in a motel. My parents are still there and we're trying to get them out right now, right? So it really, I thank you for memorializing this unique experience that so many of us kind of had and didn't really know how to talk about. For anybody else interested, New York Times did a good article about this, I want to say about 10, 15 years ago, about the Patel Motel or the Gujarati roadside motel phenomenon. So, another thing I want to ask you about, Grishma, is the title itself, right? Anagram Destiny. I found myself like trying to piece into the story where obviously the names Anya and Ayan, but then I was trying to fit in the third character and some of the other stuff and like how you juxtapose the two tragedies. What is the anagram and what is the destiny in your story?
sure. So I'll get to your question, Ramisa, in a second. And thanks, Sneha. If you want to open your mic and share your experience at the growing up at a motel, that'd be great at some point. But so the main characters in the book are Anya and Ayan, right? Anya is spelled Aanya, and Ayan is spelled Ayaan. And so obviously they're anagram of each other's names. And then Ayan means a gift to God, and Anya means an inexhaustible. And so I, at some point, was having difficulty with the title, but I had already wrote these characters. I already picked these names and wrote these whole characters out. And originally I had called it something like an anagram destiny or something like that. And the publisher's like, it's too long, drop the past tense, drop all that kind of stuff. I said, yeah, that's fine. But it's really, if you look at the through line of the story, it really matches the definitions of their name. And then of course the names are anagrammed as well. And so that's sort of where the title came from. Yeah. Really quickly to answer Misa's question, I wish I was as talented as the Schitt's Creek writers. Oh my gosh, I absolutely love that show. I think it's hilarious. But this is a little bit more serious, I would say, in its tone than Schitt's Creek, as much as I love that show. So, Misa, yeah, yeah.
I'll read Sneha's anecdote. She said some of the best days of her life cleaning rooms was fun. It was a small town. She was actually writing a story or starting to write a story based on her real life experiences.
Oh wow. Yeah, so Sneha, if like there are so many nuances in this book. As a child, I think sometimes your parents don't know how much you pick up at these motels. And so much of the book is told from a POV of them as young children. And I think, Sneha, if you lived at that roadside motel and you picked up some of those things that happen at those motels, like back in the day, you would kind of be like, oh my gosh, as kid, even as a child, even though I maybe not understood the good, like larger context of it. I mean, I kind of was like, wait, what's going on? I knew that the rooms were going at an hourly rate, which I later put together. All these little nuances that I was like, oh my gosh, like we pick up so much as children. And then we also like, there would be like these crazy weird things where to have to go turn over a room at some random hour,
So
right?
fortunately, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah.
So that's why I kept writing in the chat. But
Yeah.
yes, this is what really captivated me because I feel like you're saying, anyone that's grown up in a hotel, we can share the same sort of stories. My parents didn't have a hotel like that. It was in a very small tourist town. But I have had friends that have lived in Houston, and I've seen that 24-hour turnover and cleaning rooms with them, even at an adult age, which isn't something I expected to do. But yeah, it was definitely small town America. We didn't fit in because we were one of the few Indian families there, but we fit in because everyone thought it was cool that they could come and hang out at the hotel, and you would, like you said, you'd have a room to hang out in and whatnot. But I remember we were so young when my parents bought it that it was like it was fun to help them clean rooms and do things like that. So those fun experiences. And yeah, I think you grow skills, you grow some maturity out of it. And I love how you told us perspective from that side and that story, because I don't think people realize what an impact we've made as a community. And I think it's great. So
Thanks, Neha. And I can't, sorry, Neha, did you just say you started reading or you haven't started? You
I
just got,
started, yeah. I
okay.
have like 4 or 5 books I've started, and I'm hoping over the holidays. So when I saw this, I was so excited. I'm like, oh, I'll get to learn more. So sorry, I've just started. So I
Yeah,
appreciate you guys
that's,
coming in together with this.
yeah, that's totally fine. I also wanted to, both Radha and Sneha, I wanted to make you aware there's now an Instagram page. It's called Our Motel Stories. I don't know if either one of you
No,
have come
never
across
heard
it.
of
It
it.
just started. I want to say it's a couple of months old, but she reached like we found each other somehow, and it's just oral histories of people who grew up at motel. She interviews her like she's basically has taken a bunch of young people and trained them to like do oral storytelling and say, okay, like tell us about your experience growing up at a motel, moving in this. She's trying to capture that generation's um, stories before some of them pass or whatever it is. But I think it's really great, and just even our experiences growing up at a motel. So Sneha and Radha, please, like, I'll drop you guys. I'll drop you a thing rather where it is if you want
I'd
to
love that. Thank you.
follow.
Because I think, as I mentioned in the chat, I actually started to document not only my parents' story, but other people that I've known that I grew up in hotels. Because at that time, you would just travel to the next small town, or Garba was maybe 6 hours away for us or whatnot. And so I have so many friends who also grew up in that same way. But when you hear, like you were saying about these uncles and their stories, everybody's story is so similar that I was like, it's so important to capture this so everybody knows that the background and the time and how our community connected through this is just so important. So I would
Yeah,
appreciate that connection.
yeah, I agree, Sneha. And it was a very tight knit community at the time. It wasn't like in like what we have now, which is just there's just such a huge South Asian diaspora, and we can find communities to connect with. It was like,
Right.
okay, you're connecting because you all are here. That's it. You're connecting because you're the closest people to us. So,
Pretty
um,
much. I've heard people would open a phone book in that day and age and look at Patel and just call whatever family they could find. So
yeah,
it's just so interesting that time. So,
yeah, that's great.
well,
Uh,
thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the stuff we wanted to talk about is the themes of the American dream, right? Like Anya's childhood is at the motel. That is central to their love story, central to how their family immigration story. So, um, my biggest question throughout all of this was how much of their stories, their backgrounds, like some of them were very, very nuanced in particular Gujarati backgrounds. How much of that is reflected on in your own experiences, Grishma, or people that you knew? How much of that was through research when you were like, "Hey, I'm going to write a book"?
Yeah. So much of it is not one particular family I know or one particular individual, like an uncle or aunt I know, but it's sort of a collective of stories I've heard through the years. So I think I could do this without giving away any spoilers. There's two Gujarati families. One is, like directly from Gujarat. They left India at a certain point, and then the other Gujarati family is actually immigrated to the US through Africa. Like they actually lived in Uganda. And there's, during the exile in the 70s in Uganda, they had to move to the UK, and in the UK, they moved to the US. And the more I talk about this particular story, the more people I find who are like, oh, that was my dad, or that was my uncle, or that was my grandfather. And I do think there was a huge community um, in the 70s and 80s that was part of that Ugandan exile, because so much of Indian immigration to the southern part of like Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, all that kind of stuff happened during like colonial times, right? And those families have been there for generations. I mean, I've been to South Africa and Kenya, and I'm amazed at how much retention they have in terms of culture and all that kind of stuff. And so, in passing, I had heard a lot about the story of Uganda and the history and what had happened. And I said, I keep running into these people who tell me that their family at some point had to leave Uganda, or they used to live in Uganda and moved to Kenya. And so that bit part of it, I did research. I did a lot of like first person accounts of people who might have had to leave at the time. I didn't get into too much detail because I wouldn't know what it's like on the ground there. But there are enough sort of accounts out there that you can piece together. I mean, in some ways, it's historical fiction. I mean, not in some ways. A lot of people would just classify this as historical fiction based on time period. And so that, what I could find, I did, and I tried to stay as true to the story as possible. And I know we have a few other people on this call, but I don't know if they know, but basically a huge Indian community lived in Uganda in the 70s. And then this dictator called Idi Amin came into power. And he basically said that you all have to leave. All the Indian people have to leave the country overnight, essentially. It was a very strict ban. And so people just had to pick up families would live there for generations, like they'd come in the 1800s, early 1900s through the British, like basically slavery, had come over at the time, then established themselves, just had to leave overnight. And that's such a huge part of the history, a large part of the community that ultimately ended up in the UK and the United States and in Kenya and South Africa, or anyone went back to India. A good chunk of families just went back to India too.
Well, Grishma, Mississippi Masala, the
Yeah.
OG motel
Yeah.
movie, her father, one of the storylines is they were kicked out of Uganda, and they do a great little snippet of him remembering getting kicked out and them having to carry the suitcases and like, it
Yes.
was very well told. And that's literally what I went to as soon as that scene came up in your book was like, oh my God, Mississippi Masala.
Yeah. Well, I only would have to rewatch it because I've watched that film so many times when I was younger because it came out decades ago. And so I'll have to rewatch it. But yeah, it's such a huge part of that history. So
Guju
I
family in
would
a roadside motel. That was
yeah.
like our representation growing
Yeah,
up.
yeah. And Sneha saying she wrote an essay in college around that topic as well. So yeah. So a lot of people say that autobiographical, this novel, and I would say it's not, but the community aspect of it is very autobiographical. And these are the people I knew growing up. This is the community I grew up in. These are the people like that we went to festivals with and did Diwali with and Garba with, and these are all the snippets I've picked up along the way of the history and then tried to embed it somehow into one family story. But no, it's not one particular person, I would say.
Another part of that seeking the American dream journey that you talk about is in the other family who came directly immigrated from India and how they overstayed a student visa, got amnesty through the Reagan program. So I would, yeah, now that you mentioned, I really think this is historical fiction. You did such a good job reading the story through what was actually happening in American history. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So a lot of my, and hopefully no one watches this and tries, but a lot of students who came in the 70s, particularly like I know a lot of Gujarati men, uncles, essentially, like my uncles, I would even say, came on student visas and then just overstayed their visas and then couldn't handle the school, or the school was too expensive, whatever it was. that was their struggle at the time and so, a lot of, I grew up when a lot of them used to mention things like, oh, thank God for Reagan because he did the amnesty program. And so you're right, it is a big part of the history. And I don't know if a lot of people even fully understand or recognize that. Like they just like, oh, people came in the 70s. And, there's just all these like immigration patterns in this country and across the world. And I'm always fascinated by them. I think one topic I'm always fascinated by is like migration and immigration patterns. And so that's just one through line of the whole novel.
My last question around this topic or theme about immigration and the American dream. We're seeing this a lot more now in this newer generation, like Gen Z, younger millennials. But in the book, your main character, Anya, goes back to India for a project. And I remember my sister did this. She was a big, like, worked in the volunteer space, but she was going all over the South Asia in around the 2008 time period when Anya was there. And it was very much like, how many times did I hear, we left this country so we didn't have to do, and now you're going back? And fast forward another 15 years, now you see so many this generation cross-culturally not working, creating art cross-culturally, and so it just speaks to that full circle of the immigration.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And so, I mentioned this, like what I do for a living is teach global business. And so part of what I do, and this is the reason the story, so it's a dual timeline, plus half of it takes place in India and half of it takes place in the United States. I would say a little more than half takes place in the United States, but you get to see the India, the new India, as I call it. And essentially it's everything that I research and teach. So one thing I'm really fortunate to do is I bring students to India regularly. Like I take my class to India. Um, and we're able, like I was able to firsthand witness some of these changes as they were happening. And so in college, I did study abroad in India for a year, and it was fantastic. And then I went back like 4 or 5 years later, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like what happened? And I got fascinated by that idea, and I studied globalization in India and wrote my PhD dissertation on it as well. And then I just continued. And so what you'll see, rather, and those of you who will read the book hopefully after this chat, is I capture like sort of the rise of India and the whole story. And there's another main character named Abhi. And as you're reading Abhi, what you should essentially be thinking is Abhi is symbolic representation of India. Like it's how India is progressing, how India is moving. Like he's someone who comes from nothing and is able to move up the socioeconomic ladder, which was more or less unheard of in India prior generations. It's like you were born where you were born and you were stuck where you were born. And socioeconomic mobility wasn't really uh, achievable, right? And that's why everyone loves the American dream. It's because in the United States, socioeconomic mobility is very much feasible, right? Everyone's like, okay, we can get here, we can work really hard, and we can move up the economic financial ladder and all of that stuff. And that really happening in India in the during the whole pre-liberalization, economic liberalization. And when it started happening, it was so aspirational, and everyone was so excited about it. And now you see it really come to full fruition, like more recently. But like with the time period I've captured is when people were still like a bit skeptical. Like, is this really true? Can we really actually move out of the situation we were born into something better? And so like when you watch Avi's story, um, and when I talk about that program at the Taj Hotel, it's a real program.
Oh yeah, I'm hospitality background, so
Yes.
I'm very
Yeah, yeah,
familiar with
it's
the
a real
Todd
program.
story,
And
and I love
so
it.
I just, I think all of that like dream and all that stuff is it's a very hopeful book. I know there's some really very serious. I put you through a lot of emotional downs in the book and ups, but it's really a very much a hopeful book. Yeah.
Well, let's get into some of those emotional things. We are the Mindful Dating Book Club.
Sure.
There's a lot of complexities around love and identity and relationships. So, particularly, we talked about Abhi, right there, Abhi Manu. She is older than him. She is, let's say, marital status is different than his. And you talk about all of this, and I know from the dating aspect, this is stuff that is so prevalent in our world. Every day in our chat groups, I'm hearing about guys wanting to date younger and how to, we have a second time shadi segment, things like that. Um, Talk to me again. Maybe did you know that you were challenging the norm with these concepts, or did you do it intentionally?
Yeah, so I knew that. Oh gosh, do we want to do spoilers or do we just leave?
I say let's go ahead and do spoilers because
It's a
people in the
small
book.
group,
Yeah,
and hopefully
exactly.
they'll read it anyway. So I won't
Yeah.
do big spoilers, but I will tell you this is a book about uh Anya gets married at a young age and she loses her partner. She loses it's her childhood love and she loses him within a few months of getting married. And she very much feels responsible for that, what happened and so forth, because of a series of incidences that happened, during that time frame. And so she's sort of like she got married very young and she's also widowed very young. She's like 24 or 25. But because he was her childhood love, she had like huge difficulty kind of moving past it, and she kind of drowned herself in work in very many ways. Um, and I think that's very true of a lot of people I see now. I see a lot of, and maybe rather you could tell me because you're really in the like the uh, crux of this is that um, a lot of people use their career and like, oh, I'm so busy with my career and I got to get this accomplished and I really got to do this, as a means to like avoid the other thing if they really want a meaningful relationship, or like this is not the time, or this person really just doesn't gel with my career at the time. And I think in some ways Anya also did that. She kind of was like just became a workaholic in many ways, right? Because she didn't want to deal with this idea of like all the grief and all of that stuff. I mean, ultimately it takes her a long time to come out of that grief. Um, and then like she has this chance encounter, which we all hope for a chance encounter, uh, um, through
Destiny.
work. Yeah. And she really questions everything because he's younger than her. He's like this big eligible bachelor, and she's like, wait, I'm widowed, I'm older than you. Like she's questioning all of these things. But in reality, I think over time what she realizes is that it had nothing to do with all of those things, that societal norms. It was her. Like she needed to get past her own, you know, like sort of grief and loss and all of those things. So did I go in it intentionally? I think I wrote those scenes very intentionally. And I also wrote them. I know if you see it, you will see that the people who are more progressive in those scenes are the people in India.
Ooh, I
So
love
it's
that.
Abhi's sister who says you can take a girl out of India, but you can't take India out of the girl. And I think I was trying to kind of speak to this idea that, our families, our parents, our grandparents, they left India at a certain time period. And there's a lot of research around this, as you know, and they're stuck in that time period. And they think that's where, like, what is representative of what is going on in the country currently. But if you regularly visit India and you regularly keep in touch with when you keep in touch with the times and what people are doing, you realize that India is incredibly progressive in many ways. And a lot of people are casually dating and doing whatever else that they need to do. I mean, it's not stuck in that. And so, like, Abby's sister is really just trying to explain to her that, like, I don't know, like, I don't know where you think you are, but you're in Mumbai in 2008. Like, this is silly. Like, it's just a few years that he's younger than you. He's clearly into you. Like, what's this thing with, like, oh, like, I can't, this is a second marriage. He's not what he needs. And, like, it was just, she kind of just calls her out on her bullshit, I want to say. And I very intentionally made sure that the bullshit was called out by someone.
And it was another woman showing the progressive side again of the modern
Yeah,
India.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a push pull that we see in the modern love, but their love story actually started way back in the 80s and 90s, right? I think I did the math to see they would have been born in 1977. Like, trust me, I like did. Oh, I'm so in love with this book, Grishma. We got to make it into a movie.
I'm so
Yeah.
glad. Okay, I also have a timeline, I have Excel sheet, like when they were born, when they would be in first grade, when they would be in second grade. Because as you know, so much of the book is their childhood. Um, so go ahead.
Yeah,
I didn't
and
mean
I exactly, yeah. And so I just love I saw myself passing lockers back and forth with my crushes and this and that. So talk a little bit about, growing up or your experiences versus what you show in the book, how he knew right away that he was in love at like age 12. He was telling his parents he was going to go propose and this and that. I never saw any pushback from the family, right? I think that my experience growing up was like, I don't care if the boy's next door. We also had like the motel family down the street with the boy my age, blah, blah, blah. But it was never encouraged or allowed that we would have any sort of relationship. So maybe was that just you having fun with this story?
part of it was me having fun, but also that these families were that close. And there is a bit of a like I have a bit of a conflict with it because one family has really pulled the other family in and has kind of helped them navigate the country, right? So it's her family that has helped his family throughout this whole process, right? Like, oh, we're gonna hire you at this motel till you get on your feet, like the whole bit, right? So there's a bit of an unequal relationship with the families to begin with. And I do know people who met at roadside motels and ultimately got married. As like I know a whole bunch of people who like they like would like met as children and then now they're married and they have kids of their own, and it's because the families were so close and they said, well, we can't like what are we going to go look for, you know what I mean, in a partner for our a daughter or child. And so yes, I think the parents at some point were like, oh, you're too young for all of this, right? And that generation, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, is like that generation just goes from you were too young for any of this to okay, now you got to get married, and there's no like in between phase. And that's when the time frame of the book is that it's not modern dating, that which is like I think more parents are a little more understanding. Hopefully now it's like, oh no, you should please go date and experiment and all that kind of stuff. So I think I just wanted it to be like these families from the beginning were very much about these two being together. Like they understood that these were two people who were in some ways soulmates. Like they just from a young age, And I say that very well knowing that they're young, they got married young, and I have no idea that something could have happened differently for them, like, 20 years after they got married or 5 years after. But this is where that's where we like left it, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, I've also heard it the other way, right? Childhood sweethearts get married and then it doesn't end up working out. So you're right. Anything could have happened. You would just memorialize it at this juncture.
Yeah.
So one kind of last thing about the love and love and theming aspect, because I think some people might be dropping off. It's totally fine.
Yeah. I think we
So
lost it.
her mom also, you mentioned like, she encourages her to get back out there and start dating again. So that modernization or that understanding that between mother and daughter, about how like maybe what's good for you is trying again or finding love again. Whereas I think in older generations, like how we considered widowhood was very different. Yeah, just
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's
I think that and I've seen this change, and I'm sure many of you who are on this, I don't know everyone's age, you've seen a change in your parents. Like they're growing with, like a lot of parents who had very steadfast beliefs at some point have watched their family and friends, children, maybe date someone outside of their own, like, community, or date someone who's older or younger or whatever it is. I think parents are also over time learning that that's okay because they're watching these relationships progress and seeing that, oh, okay, it's totally fine. At least I've seen it happen in my community and my family that over time, like even my own parents, like maybe 15 or 20 years ago, they very much were like, oh, you should just, marry someone within our community and like all of this. And now they're like, get married to whoever you want as long as you're happy. And it's like such a big turnaround for them, because they're seeing that happiness and a good relationship is not tied to necessarily like, okay, this person has to be from a particular place and born into a particular situation. And I very much wanted to make sure that I was showing that the parents were also changing, right? She was like, no, you should get out there and date again. It's also, Anya's mom is someone who also went through a lot of trauma in her own life. And I think we see this with our moms a lot. Our moms and grandmothers went through so much, and they thought that that's how it had to be. Like you somehow just had to struggle. That's how it is. Like as a woman, you have to struggle and that's it. And now they're beginning to see, like, oh my God, we were wrong. You don't have to. Right. And they're really trying to turn situations around for their daughters and granddaughters. They're like, no, like just because we had to deal with it doesn't mean you have to. And it's so beautiful to see that change. I've definitely seen it in aunts in my, like, the aunties in my family, at least, in the last couple of decades. And they're all, even at some points, just like admit, like, we were so wrong, in the way that, and you can't blame them in some way because that's all they knew and that's all they were kind of told their whole life. Like, this is how it has to be. It's now the other way around. I'm telling my mom all the time, like, you don't have to deal with this. Like, oh, that person in your life, like, you don't have to hang out with them anymore if you're not happy with them. And she's like, really? I'm like, yeah, just don't invite them over if you don't like them.
Yeah, the obligation part of it, right? They just grew up thinking one way. Rumisa said that, our parents imprinted us with these conservative values. We talked about when they left India, that's the year that stuck in their mind, right? Now they're becoming more liberalized than us, and they're telling us anyone, a Martian, any color, even purple, totally fine. Just find your person.
Yeah, yeah. Which is a nice, it's a nice progression to see. But I think in terms of the novel and the book, I was trying to capture that progression in a very nuanced way, right? It's not like sort of in your face. I think, and fiction is never really meant to be in your face. It's just a story about people, and hopefully you like the characters enough. But there is a nuance of all the progression taking place within characters over time, right? You see Anya progress, you see her parents progress. It's, and you see all of like India and people with the people you meet with in India through the book at a totally different like progression level than maybe your parents describe them and so forth. And really, like when Anya lands in India, she comes to this realization that, oh my God, all the stuff you guys told me was wrong. You know what I mean? I think the first scene in the book is like, she's paranoid when she lands because all these people told her, like, oh, watch out, everyone's going to come be out to get you. And then she's like, no one's out to get me. And I've had that experience, right? I went to study abroad in India at college for a year, and every, I think, person in my family at some point told my parents, like, you're really going to send your 19-year-old daughter to India, to Delhi. I studied in Delhi for a year. And they're like, you're going to send your 19-year-old daughter to study for a whole year in Delhi. Do you know Delhi? Delhi's like the place of scams and blah, 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 all this stuff. And my dad's like, if you want to do this, you should go. I trust you. Just you do whatever you do in here, which is be careful. And I had the best time ever. I mean, I have such a sweet spot for Delhi. But it's not what people think. And a lot of those people had never been to India or Delhi in a really long time.
But kind of like we were talking about earlier, right? Like they left India and we're all like
Yeah.
going back. They were like, why are you going back? Right. So
Yeah.
that's very
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the symbolism as kind of our last big topic. Obviously the two, oh, sorry, so
Let's
Ramisa is
let you.
asking, do you see any differences in Indian hospitality industry, maybe focus more on rehabilitating heritage Havelis or five-star tourist experiences, versus expat hospitality, more focused on table stakes and survival?
Wow, this is such a good. I mean, it's a question I have to process. So
What
first
I'm
of all,
interpreting it is like, do
yeah,
you think that like the Indian hospitality is more like about five-star hotels, about the vibe, if you will, whereas in America it was more about us like surviving, or maybe that's a contrast that you were trying to draw. Maybe that's what she's asking.
yeah, yeah. So I think what the contracts I was trying to also show is that she grows up at a roadside motel, which is a very like literally like a roadside motel. And like the progression and survival of the American dream. Whereas when she moves to India to work at the Taj Palace Hotel, that is the top luxury hotel. In India, it's a very symbolic hotel as well. And so very much I was trying to show the contrast between like living out the American dream. I don't know if Rumi said that's exactly what your question was, but I do see the contrast. And I think very much like, I think there are also like kind of survival type hotels in India, but I think what we see, especially now with social media and all those, is this like sort of luxury palace type hotels, lots of destination weddings, that kind of thing. Yeah.
In the story yourself, you'd mentioned when they were children and they go back to India and they stay in a motel and they how the
Yeah.
parents are all like, because they know what hospitality is like
Yeah.
when they're offering it to paying guests, and now when they're a paying guest they're not getting it back. That reminded me of my father so much. Just a quick anecdote: my father grew up outside of India. He grew up in Aden, Yemen. Same thing, the British regime was kicked out in the 60s, so he had to go back to India. He never set foot in India till he was a teenager. Long story short, now anytime he goes back he always complains. He's like, oh, like, oh, I've been, I do my business. I So he always complains, and that scene really reminded me of my parents.
Yeah.
Rumisa mentioned, although behind the scenes, Taj might be very gritty too. The workers are on the ground that stand up these luxury experiences are just like the expat brown workers in the Middle East.
I mean, very much it could be. I know that the Taj is also known as to treat its employees very, very well. So I'm not speaking for all hotels in India, but I could assure you that if you speak to the workers, even at the Taj, Ratan Tata has this whole like had this whole value system of how people should be treated and trained within hospitality and just in general training. And there's a bunch of research around it, which I used for the book. And so, yeah, when we say you probably are very much correct for maybe other luxury brands. And it could be true, but I don't know. I do feel like Taj tries really hard to make sure it maintains some level of, and I capture that in the program that I talk about in the book.
I don't know which, there's a documentary, I think it might be the Fareed Zakaria one about 2611. And they go into the ethos, like, and they follow those managers. There really were heroes like Abhi in real life that say, because the ethos of Taj is nobody gets turned away, nobody gets left behind, right?
Yeah,
Like it's
yeah, and
beautiful.
exactly. And there's a really good Harvard Business um, publication on it as well, on what happened and the ethos of Taj and all of those things. So yeah.
So speaking of Taj, one of the similarities we talked about, like a roadside motel and the Taj Palace, do they obviously we talked about the luxury elements of it all, but like was there a symbolism that you wanted to use outside of the other historical context at the Taj? Was there a reason why it was like hospitality to hospitality?
Well, I did want to show, and I don't know if it was so much hospitality has, but I did want to show her the contrast in her lifestyle, right? Which is the lifestyle that she came from or grew up in, was very different from like moving back to India wasn't like, oh, now she has to rough it. Like moving back to India was living was like cushy expat life. And we did it. My husband and I did an expat assignment many years ago to Singapore, and one of the things I took away from it is like expat living is very cushy. So I captured a bit of that, and I know a lot of people. So expat assignments have become a little less common now than they were during the late 90s to about 2012, I want to say. It's mainly because as India was rising, there was a dearth of leadership talent. So we had all this technical talent, but we didn't have a lot of leadership talent. It still had to be nurtured, and people still had to move up the leadership chain. And so a lot of expats were being asked to go to India, particularly expats of Indian origin who understood the culture. And over time, as India has grown and progressed, the leadership talent is more homegrown, right? Because a lot of those people then eventually moved up the value chain at a corporate place, or all of this training came in and so forth. So you're seeing a lot less. And so the time period you're looking at, if you went to India during that time period, I go to India a lot for work. you would have found a lot of expats during that time. And it's simply because of the economic progression of India at the time, which was growing very, very fast. And it didn't, the skills did not meet the demand of the labor. And so, and yeah, that's a little
No,
side.
that makes sense. There was a short-lived NBC sitcom around that time period called Outsourced
Yes,
about
yeah,
this very same concept. Yeah,
yeah.
I love it. One more symbolism thing, and again, I'm just asking if it was intentional or not, but that stuck out to me is with Anya's first love, he also had a sister and they were very close, and Aditi played a central role in her story. Fast forward to the second love, he also has a sister, and she also plays a central role to a certain part of the story. Like, was that intentional? Where did that come from, the sister?
I love sibling, I have a sister very close to her. I think, if anyone who has a sibling or a cousin that they're very close to or who is treated like a sibling, they're kind of around to talk sense into you sometimes, and they know you so well. They've known you since birth for the most part, and they know much more also, like they know your parents, right? And you see, like young, like we as siblings, we always know how to work through the dynamic of parents. And there's only like one other person in the world who understands your parents' dynamic in some way. And so, I mean, it could have been a best friend, it could have been someone else, but I was like, in during that time when you lived at a motel, we didn't live up like very traditionally, right? Like, oh, we're gonna go to a friend's house and hang out, like, or we're gonna go drop this person off for a play date. Your like only real friend was your sibling. You just hung out with your sibling, no matter how old or young they were. You're like, okay, like it's just you and me because we can't just go like, go to like the roller skating rink or whatever, like, cohorts are doing that
And there's
night.
no neighbors, right? You're literally off the
Yeah,
side of a road. There's truck
yeah,
drivers and things. So, like we,
yeah,
that's it. You're nowhere to
yeah,
go. Oh.
yeah. So
Let's talk a little bit about the destiny aspect, and then and anybody, if there's any questions, Susan, Ramisa, definitely feel free to jump in and ask. But let's talk a little about destiny. Fate, destiny. It's in the name. What role would you say fate played, or what was that hand kind of guiding Anya's story, right, from beginning to end, and the two big things?
yeah. I think so much of it. I think so much of um, what we do, and I'm sure Lisa and Susan could sometimes must have some experience in their life. They're like so much is just like being at the right time, place at the right time, right? And I feel like, or like, I don't mean like a romantic partner, but it's like meeting someone, even meeting a really good friend who could change your life. It's sometimes just like, wait, was this meant to be? Because we cross paths at a particular point or whatever, right? And so I think this idea that she goes back to India and that's where she finds hope again, whereas her parents moved to America to find hope. I think that played a big part in this idea of destiny. So I like, am I a big believer of destiny and things are predestined and it's going to be? No, absolutely not. But I do feel like certain little moments are meant to be like you're just at the right place at the right time. Or sometimes you're at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I
It
agree.
could work the other way around as well.
Most of dating, I say 90% of dating is timing, right? You're too
Yeah.
busy, they're too busy, you didn't meet, you didn't swipe on the app at the same time,
Yeah.
whatever. My husband and I, we both went to the same Samaj convention, just different years. And finally, 3 years later, we connected, things like that.
Yeah.
But, at the end, the reason I'm bringing this up is at the end of the epilogue, she mentions how her whole, like the past 20 year or 10, 15 years since it happened, she's thinking, had I let him know, had I sent a text, had I followed up, but then she forgives herself and kind of, she doesn't use the words fate or destiny, but that's the sentiment in the fact that there were so many little micro movements and micro things. Like if you think about it, if you peel back at the million-foot level, like who Ayan was as a person, that was his whole lifetime of little moments. Nothing could have changed
Yeah.
what happened in the end.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love.
I know it's a series of events that just, are destined that, and that's where you end up where you're in. And I don't think anyone could be blamed for it or can hold guilt for it. I mean, that's what it is. And I think anyone who's experienced any kind of tragedy has questioned every move before it, right? Any small little incident, you're like, oh, if I had just left the house earlier, or if I had done this differently, or anything like that. So
Susan mentioned, she met some good new friends at some of our speed dating events, and she wouldn't have met them or she hadn't gone. So the friendship was destiny for her. Thank you, Susan.
thanks, Susan. I'm glad. I'm so glad. Yeah.
So, Grishma, what's next for you? I know this is your debut novel, but you're doing a lot of great work in your day job.
Yeah. So, gosh, next for me, I mean, I definitely, I think if you don't know a lot of people who've written a novel or writers, you definitely keep your day job until you become very famous, which has not happened yet. So I will continue to teach and be an academic. And I have a couple ideas brewing for a second novel, but nothing concrete. Like I can't tell you another novel is coming out in a year or anything like that because it's just this one's taken a toll on me. It took a long time to get this out in the world. Um, and not just the writing, but publishing and all of that kind of stuff. So I hope to work on a second piece. For now, I'm waiting for the novel to release in India. It didn't officially release in India through a publisher, but it's going to release hopefully early next year. And so I hope that the audience in India, actually the Indian audience itself, appreciates it or likes it. So I'm looking forward to that. And that's really it for now. Short term, I just want to enjoy the holidays, take a breather.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've
Yeah.
had a record year, and as I mentioned, you mentioned I met you. I saw you through an article, so luckily the press is still going. We're going to be posting this recording, and we've been talking about you a lot. I thoroughly love this book. Like it really just spoke to me as a personal. It was so much of my story. So thank you for getting it out on paper and sharing it with the world. I hope it goes somewhere. Like, how do we get this into a movie or something? Like, yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to manifest it or be, like you said, it's destiny and fate. Like so much of and I believe this with the book is so much of it is going to be the right person reading it at the right time. If there's a future for it in film or whatever it is, and a lot of people have told me it's like a very cinematic kind of book, like they could see it as a movie. And I said, well, it just has to end up in the right person's hand at the right time, because that's how a lot of these things happen. If someone reads and they're like, oh, okay, so hopefully let's cross our fingers for that, Radha.
Absolutely. Well, the rest of this crew, we are hope you guys enjoy the holiday. We did have an earlier meeting this month because of the holiday. We're going to be announcing the January book shortly so that you can read it over the break. So stay tuned for that. And lastly, Grishma, again, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and thank you for sharing your story.
Absolutely. And I'm assuming neither one of them have questions, so we're good. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Awesome.